starting the recording. Can I just check that I'm still audible to everyone? And that you can now see the presentation, the first slide of the presentation on your screen? Yes, great. All right, here we go. So today we'll be talking about esports. That's the theme of this week's motion. There's a few things I want to do before we get into the topic. First of all, I have a drink here. It's Mountain Dew, a true gamer's drink, so I'm just going to have a sip of that. Secondly, since I can't see Discord, I'm going to need someone to let me know via messages if there are any questions coming up. Dropped something, whatever. Let's see. In the audience, we have from Pool Liudas. Liudas does a lot of registration stuff. Notas. Note. If you can, message me on Facebook whenever there's a question because I can't see it. So that's the deal. If I miss it, yeah, my bad. Generally, in terms of questions and all of that, I am very much a person who likes to take questions whenever you guys want. So don't wait until the end of the workshop. If you have questions during the middle about specific things, you want me to elaborate, etc., please do ask questions. My general mantra with this is there's no stupid questions during workshops, Q&As, trainings, etc., whatever is related to debating. There are only, let's say, silly statements made later on during debates if those questions are not asked, which was taught by one of my uni professors. And thirdly, but not lastly, I hope this is visible. I'm going to check if this is visible. I am wearing a Navi jersey. Navi is a, not to sponsor for fully, if the full name is used, is an esports organization based in Ukraine where the conflict caused by Russia has been ravaged, and throughout it, Navi has still remained steadfast and one of the biggest organizations in the history of esports and in esports in general. So first of all, glory to Ukraine, you know. I hope everything works out there. But a special shout out to the organization as well, because just this week they signed this kid called Jugs to their academy for Counter-Strike, academy team. And they also have my ex-teammate on the main team, Justinas Lekavičius, JL. So shout out to the Navi organization, glory to Ukraine. And now we begin talking about esports, about the workshop part, with all of the tributes to Mountain Dew, Ukraine, and my esports buddies. Really the question is, how the hell did we get to this point where, as you can see on your screens, there's a goddamn full arena of people watching people play video games. How did we get here? Is one of the themes of this workshop. And there's going to be 7 parts to this workshop in specific. So, you know, first of all, we're going to talk about the history of esports. Secondly, like a short overview of current relevant games to provide you with some knowledge of, you know, the games that are relevant if you don't have that. Term and structure types and issues, more on like if this seems like a confusing thing to you now, just wait until we get to it because it's actually quite simplistic, but it's often used in debating motions. Fourthly, geopolitical implications, because as with sports, as with anything else, there are many geopolitical implications with esports in general. Then I'm gonna yell at a cloud about the esports winter, What is the esports winter? Well, we'll talk about that a bit later. Then we're going to look at some debating motions on esports. We might do some practice depending on the mood, the vibe, or we might just, not do it and just think about those motions and talk about them. And lastly, Q&A on anything I missed. Yeah, I also found where to add stickers on Canva, as you can see. But this is very much indicative of what esports is like in the present. It does seem like it's game over, and it does seem that everyone and like en masse is selling, and nobody's investing, which is where this term of the esports winter comes about. Anyway, with that said, let's get into the first part, namely the history of esports. Is there any questions before I go on? Let's see, chat. No. I'm pretty sure we're good, right, so far? All right, history of esports. So first of all, we have the, this is my way of looking at esports, right? It's not necessarily the correct the correct timeline, but it's roughly the agreed upon timeline in terms of how esports has functioned in general. So first of all, there's a pre-stage, the early stages, which is 70s to 80s, when you had video game arcades and video game records and some very, very small events in general taking place. But I don't really consider that to be part of esports history, because it was just the growth of gaming in general as a thing in culture. Then in the early stages, the 1990s, you have establishment of some professional organizations that remain to this day. I think the organization that I was paying tribute to, Navi, was founded in early 2000s, 2003, 2002. So not quite here, but some of the organizations, such as Evil Geniuses, who are a horrible organization and are now fully leaving esports as we speak, were founded back in those days. There was also a growth of games like StarCraft and Street Fighter primarily. StarCraft is like a game where you control units, and Street Fighter is, well, it's a fighting game. Primarily, though, the gaming scene and the esports scene saw growth mostly in Asia and the US. So when we're speaking of Asia, we're mostly speaking of South Korea, Japan, some adoption in China, but that was a bit later on. And the US was mostly, let's say, StarCraft, for example, was a big Asia thing, and eventually became entirely dominated by South Koreans. Street Fighter, on the other hand, had mostly a US-centric audience, so to say. Anyway, so that was, skill issue. So that was the early stages, right? The birth of esports, but not really anything super important happening. This, however, is far more important as a period, the early professionalization period, which was basically all of 2000s. We had the beginning of this period, I think, is marked by the South Korea establishing the Korea Esports Association, also known as KESPA, in 2000. KESPA to this day remains in control of all esports in Korea. That means that even games like League of Legends that are technically owned by companies that are owned by companies like Riot, which are owned by Tencent, which is a big Chinese organization, right? They still have to regulate themselves by KESPA's alignments, and KESPA is an official part of the South Korean governmental structure. Now, on the other side of the globe, you had the World Cyber Games. These were primarily held in the USA and were often televised. Now, this is where you had a lot of that early 2000s VC money coming in. Capitalists becoming more interested in video games. The products were very much let's say, impure. So, for example, in Counter-Strike, typically you would, as an observer, view the game from the person's point of view, from the person who was shooting. The events that were held on Counter-Strike that were televised instead were all just like overviews of the map, etc., never actually showing how people are aiming and how people are actually playing, besides like a general view, right? Like, let's say the norm is that, like, in basketball, we're used to seeing the whole court. And that was the norm that these TV companies, these capitalist influences, wanted to impose on esports in general. And unfortunately, it proved to be basically a big failure, big money sink, which in turn was combined with the financial crisis. So towards the end of the 2000s, we have the failure of professionalization, right? Like, this whole growth and early good signs basically fell apart. Casper is still a thing, as I mentioned, so that didn't fall apart exactly. One thing I should address, and you'll note that in every slide I have esports written this way. Casper does it this way. There's multiple ways to spell esports. For what it's worth, I stand strongly by this one because it's just the original term. I'm a conservative, let's say, when it comes to video games. So yeah, Casper, rename yourself is my message to them. Regardless, the early professionalization period basically ends with the financial crisis and multiple companies pulling out. So that leads to the first winter of esports, which is the early 2000s. Financial crisis, only some companies remain, etc., etc. And then you have the rise of the current professional esports. This could really be divided into two parts, right? So 2013 to 2017 was like the early growth, where you didn't really have the massive viewership numbers that you would towards this period. But you could also sum it up into one larger period. You had games primarily like League of Legends, Dota, Counter-Strike, all being heavily funded by VC funding or by company funding. So in the case of LoL, for example, Tencent themselves would finance the esports scene a lot. Riot would invest a lot, but also VC money, which is basically venture capitalists, invested heavily into various rising organizations. And, you know, this also was implemented alongside monetization models like skins. So basically, skins being things that you put on your weapons or your character or whatever that make you look cool and look nice. And all of these things combined pushed esports to extreme heights of popularity. Like, I think Dota's prize pool and Fortnite's prize pool was definitely in the tens of millions. So this period was just crazy. If we look back at slide 3, you see the final sentence of heavy capitalist influences rise as more companies get involved. Okay, that's a grammar mistake. And then we have VC funding and monetization in this one. And note how this ends in 2021, 2022. So, what is next in the history of esports? We have the current esports winter, which, I'm sorry, I structured this workshop in a bit of a mean way. I don't think we are yet at the knowledge part needed to talk about the current esports winter. So there's a bunch of the other things that I talked about in the structure of this workshop that we have to get through before we get to talking about the present, the current situation of esports. Now, while I take a short drink, does anyone have a question or anything of the sort? Great. That either means I'm doing amazingly or terribly. I know you guys are also here for cat content, so yep. There's yep. Yeah. Now, moving on from the history of esports. Yeah. Moving on from the history of esports, I'm going to do a quick overview of current relevant games. This is going to be actually quick. So first of all, we have first-person shooters. So shooters where you view everything from first person. So that means theoretically from the eyes of the person who you are playing as. So the most relevant ones here are Counter-Strike Global Offensive / Counter-Strike 2. So Counter-Strike Global Offensive was the original, well, it's not the original Counter-Strike by far, but it was the most recent game, and now it got updated to Counter-Strike 2. That's the new version, but the transition is very much in its early stages, so I put both on there, just to say so. This is going to be relevant with different structure types, but on the other hand, you have Valorant. This one is owned by Riot Games, or the owners of League of Legends as well. It's a direct competitor to Counter-Strike, owned by Valve. Now, they differ very heavily in how they handle their games. We're going to talk more about this later when we get to the structure of events. And then in terms of first-person shooters, you have Quake, which exists, and we don't need to talk about Quake because it's irrelevant. Now, just to clarify, I think Quake takes an amazing amount of skill. It's just not a relevant esport. Now, next you have MOBAs, so multiplayer online battle arenas. These are games like League of Legends or Dota 2, where you control a character and you have to, as a team, push to beat the enemy, etc., etc. You have to essentially destroy someone's base, right? That's the basic concept, and you're controlling one character, typically out of 5, on your team, and the other team also has 5, and everyone's playing, etc., etc. I have a messenger notification. Okay, that's not from Notas, so okay. Overwatch 1 and Overwatch 2, they're kind of MOBAs, but they are a first-person shooter, but the concept is for it to emulate MOBAs in terms of the abilities that you have, in terms of ultimate abilities, in terms of the goal not being just to get the most kills or like to plant the bomb or whatever. I put in question marks here because much like Quake, Overwatch is dying. Overwatch is an esport. Look, like, give it a year from now and Overwatch will be fully dead besides being a casual game. This is a workshop about esports. Overwatch is no longer going to be an esport. So I don't see a reason why I should talk about this too much. Now, there's also the other category, right? Which is, well, there's a question mark here, right? First of all, the most valid of the esports named here probably is Formula 1 esports and other racing simulations. Formula 1 esports is actually like really bad, and other racing simulations are actually really good. But the question as to whether they are truly like similar to a sport or they're more of an esport because you're just driving a car, and the simulations are supposed to mimic a car, like where does reality basically come in? And the same applies here to, for example, bicycle esports, which is basically mimicking real sport. You have a bicycle at your home, and you're biking, and you're trying to race people, essentially like you would outside, except from the comfort of your own home. There's also arguments that chess could be an esport, or is it? Like, the thing is, like, I don't know the answers to these questions. That's why I put the question mark here. You could make the argument for all of these, that all of these are esports. You could make the argument that none of these are esports. So drawing a line between what sports and what sports is and what is esports has become particularly difficult, which we'll get onto when we talk about the Olympic Games. Right. Term and structure, types and issues. I'm pretty sure this is just one slide. Yeah. So essentially, the debate here comes down to franchising versus a grassroots scene. So grassroots being born from itself or born naturally, grown naturally, etc., etc. Franchising is when a certain entity creates artificially a league, and then so for example, like what's a real sport example that we could use? Like the Premier League or any football league whatsoever, the NBA, right? Like grassroots doesn't necessarily mean that the NBA couldn't exist, but franchising is pushing for it actively and ignoring whether growth is actually possible. And this essentially means that franchising versus grassroots comes down to publisher or developer controlled entities versus independent tournaments such by companies like external companies that didn't make these games, such as ESL, IM, and others. These are essentially like TV companies, right? Like the equivalent would be BBC, whatever. And these are two drastically different models. When we talked about a couple slides ago about Counter-Strike 2 and Valorant, this is probably the best. And similarly, wait, I got lost. Counter-Strike 2 and Valorant, one owned by Valve, one owned by Riot. League of Legends, owned by Riot. Dota 2, owned by Valve. Both of them take drastically different approaches to the approach, essentially, to the issue at hand, right? So Riot is way more pro-franchising in terms of they actively exclude other independent tournament organizers from being able to organize their events unless they are given explicit permission. Valve, on the other hand, just lets anyone host a tournament, basically. But they also host their own big tournaments, right? So they host what's called a major in both Dota and in both Counter-Strike, where it's essentially the World Championship. Invites are based either on direct qualification or results in these independent tournaments. So that means that a mixture of both is certainly possible, but it can also be mutually exclusive, right? There's obviously multiple issues that come from both, right? Franchising means essentially that you are selling a product, you are selling it to companies. This was particularly relevant during the growth of League of Legends and currently Valorant, where multiple companies bought slots in leagues created by Riot, whether that be for League of Legends or Valorant, for up to $30 million. And eventually these are companies that are now exiting the scene because they are bleeding money. And esports generally is not seen as a profitable venture. Very, very few esports companies will ever be anything close to profitable. And the vast majority are certainly not profitable. Also, in terms of that, Valve, the independent tournament supporters, let's say, but still hosting their own global championships, have decided that ESL, amongst other companies, such as Blast, can no longer have franchise systems. So these independent tournament organizers started to basically abuse their power, and they created their own leagues. So ESL created their own league, Blast, another company, created their own league in Counter-Strike, and they invited certain teams basically to sign a contract. They also had to pay a big buy-in fee, etc., etc. And so the independent tournament scene became no longer open. It became exclusive almost to the teams that are rich and to the teams that are basically actively with heavy followings. It would be impossible, for example, for me and four of you to go into a Counter-Strike server and qualify for, an ESL franchise league event, which is the whole idea of independent tournaments, right? That anyone can qualify. It's the whole idea of the majors in so-called Counter-Strike in Dota, that there is always a path to qualify if you, theoretically, like, you and 4 friends could, right? That's the idea behind it. Is that ever going to happen? No. But theoretically, that's the goal that's the debate of grassroots, right? Yeah. Obviously, issues that come with both. I already talked about this a bunch. Independent tournaments, they become abusive. Valve imposed a ban in 2025. Companies like ESL and Blast can no longer have basically these franchise regions, these franchise so-called tournaments. They have to make their pools open according to a ranking that Valve themselves have developed, or make qualifiers open. Publisher-developer controlled franchising systems. Yeah, like, so many issues. League of Legends in North America is failing. League of Legends in Europe is cutting down funding. League of Legends in Korea somehow is fading, even though it's Korea, and South Korea loves League of Legends. And the only place where it's succeeding really is China. Valorant has been like a sort of success, but now everyone's cutting back money, even though that's like a franchise system, because everyone's losing money because of the VC money disappearing. Where we get to, we're gonna get to the esports winner. Yeah, there's a lot of issues with esports. The lesson to take from this is that none of these is ever perfect. That's the reason why esports motions are debatable in the first place, because neither side is right. So the thing is, like, never ever should it be possible for a debate to be let's say, sorry, I got confused by a message. It's what was my prior thought? Yeah, like in any debate, there shouldn't, like, if a motion is set, both sides have to be debatable, right? That's why we're hosting this workshop, right? That's why I think my headphones just turned off. They definitely turned off. I hope that doesn't screw up with the recording or anything, but whatever. So my point being, if there's a motion, I mean, it has to be debatable. So franchise and grassroots, both not ideal. Now I have a message from Notas, who has a question. Notas, are you okay with me reading oh my god, are you okay with me reading the message to everyone? Right. Sorry for going back, bet aš a bit confused dėl KESPA. Are imposing regulations on all games or tik South Korea games? What kind of regulations are these? Okay. I need to go into slides again. I'll answer that. Or I'll repeat the question just so everyone hears it again. Yep. Yeah, going back on KESPA. So KESPA is officially part of the Korean government. KESPA imposed regulations on all games in South Korea. Tai reiškia, kad jie imposed savo regulations on whether games can be not played, but whether they can be transluojami, whether they can be published, and so forth and so forth. That means, for example, if I'm Riot or if I'm Valve and I want to host an event or host a league, I'm gonna have to follow KESPA's regulations. Often these regulations could mean things like we control the broadcast, ane visiškai, ir jūs neturit jokio input, or you have to have a Korean broadcast as well language, that has to be in the main language in the arena, a la French law apie kaip galima tik French speaking per certain renginius, tai that could be a thing. Forcing the majority of players to be from South Korea in teams, that could be a thing. But basically they can impose influence on any game they want, not South Korean games, but any game they want in terms of how the game is translated into a product into an esport in the future. Does that make more sense? Prašau, notai atrašyk. Yeah. Was anyone else confused by that? Is there any more, like, because this is a good time, like, I think we're gonna get into geopolitics. So like this is the halfway point. Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone want to speak? Rise up, ask a question. No? Well, we've been going for a long time. So I'm gonna take a short 2-minute break to go to the toilet. Yeah. And then we can continue the workshop. If you do have any questions in the meantime, please figure them out. Anyway, I'll leave you here for a second. All right, any questions? Any questions? No? Still no questions. Great. I need to see one thing. So the good news is I remember this. The bad news is I deleted one of the slides before presenting. So in terms of the overview of current relevant games, there's also Battle Royale games. These are games like Fortnite, these are games like Call of Duty Warzone, these are games like Apex Legends, where ultimately either you or a group of 3-4 friends are trying to be the last ones to survive in a match, right? These esports are largely self-contained, so like they don't really overlap with any of the overarching trends. Of course, like the economic downturn, etc., like that's still a thing for them. But largely, by far, these aren't esports that you'll often have motion set. One final thing in terms of the franchising versus grassroots or the publisher, developer controlled and independent tournaments, just to make it easier to track, and I'll repeat this again, Counter-Strike 2 and Dota 2 are controlled by Valve, who are a US company who make great video games. Valorant and League of Legends are owned by Riot, who are owned by Tencent, who are a Chinese company, and they prefer the franchise model. Dota 2 and Counter-Strike 2 is often referred to as the independent or the open model, right? So just in case you're confused, Riot is League of Legends and Valorant, and Valve is Counter-Strike and Dota. Valve prefers independent tournaments and their own world championships. Riot likes having full control over their games. Now, let me just check any questions now. Geopolitical implications. There are so many here, and we already spent quite a bit of time discussing. So, yeah, I'm gonna run over this a bit quickly. The US, infamous for sponsoring video games, sponsored Counter-Strike's major, which is like the world championship that Valve holds. So like, even when they hold the world championship, it's ESL or IEM or Blast or another company holding the world championship for them. It's just called the world championship. So this one was held by a company called E-League, and during this major in 2018, the world championship, US Air Force was an official sponsor. That's obviously controversial to many, like for many different reasons. Saudi Arabia is now using kind of the esports winter as an opportunity to do some esports washing. They're going to have this event called the Global Esports Games 2023, which I think is in November or October. Wait, no, maybe in December, or yeah. But basically big prize pools, lots of money, millions being spent. They also bought ESL, the company that we were talking about here, and now they own ESL outright. The PIF, the Private Investment Fund, I think, is basically, they are the owners of ESL by a bunch of shell companies called Savvy. Not getting into it, but basically Saudi Arabia bought ESL as the TLDR. They are also building their own esports team called Team Falcons. They were linked with some very big names in terms of players. And during podcasts, their CEO failed multiple times to answer where's the money coming from, because apparently it's totally not coming from the Saudi Arabian government guys. It's totally okay, don't worry about it. You know, the sarcasm in my voice should tell you a bunch. South Korea also want to maintain their grip of dominance over many of the games, because they are quite dominant in most games, except Counter-Strike. Counter-Strike is a Europe thing, and I'm not sure about Dota. But they also have the Asian Games. As some of you may or may not know, the Asian Games happen once every, I can't recall how many years. But esports, specifically League of Legends, is now part of the Asian Games. And much like winning any like big football trophy provides exemptions to South Korean military service, winning the Asian Games, which South Korea did this year, provides military exemptions for all 6 participants. So, you know, that just shows you how big esports has gotten, right? Like, these people are, to us Westerners, it seems almost weird, like, in South Korea and China in particular, esports like figures are actually glorified to an extreme extent, where like they appear on shampoos and all of that stuff, right? Like, it's the nature and the height of esports in some of the countries that um, that have popularized, like have heavily invested in it and popularized it, is crazy. The Olympics is also adding esports. A bunch of sports like e-football, e-basketball, which basically FIFA and NBA 2K. They're testing League of Legends and like a bunch of other things. But basically, the Olympics is sort of committed to adding esports as part of their long-term agenda. And yeah, that means that there's probably going to be a bunch of esports washing happening everywhere. Much like we have sports washing, the future seems not so bright for esports, and the future seems very much bright for the people who will want to invest money into esports washing. Now, on to the esports winter. All right. So, 2022, 2021, COVID pandemic starts. A bunch of people start staying in. Esports viewership goes up because it's a product you can consume at home, right? So even though the whole global economy is going down, esports is seen as a great investment because people are gonna want to see it all the time. But then the pandemic ends and there's a recession, and at the same time VC companies don't see the massive yield they expected because viewership has now dropped, and sponsors begin pulling out essentially en masse, right? What that means is that, as Bloomberg says here, the hype around esports is fading as investors and sponsors dry up. VCT Americas, Valorant League Americas, teams reportedly downsizing Valorant operations amid esports winter. This is a big podcast about, the esports winter, etc., Three very much relevant people who have been around for ages in the esports space, although they are problematic in many ways, discussing the state of esports. And really, the state of esports is, frankly, just garbage, right? Investor money has dried up, certainly. There's very little to no investment. Viewership is struggling. Teams got used to operating at costs that VC investors allowed them to, which allowed them to give these garbage, huge contracts to people to players who definitely didn't deserve it. And so wages have now begun to drop, not only for the players, but all of the staff behind the scenes, the people getting laid off in the companies. Basically, we're just like going through the same cycle again as, before, where everything is kind of, just being extremely massively downsized. There's a few bright spots. So we have Counter-Strike 2, that's a new game. Valorant is not looking great in terms of the current economic situation, but once everyone gets used to overspending and then they suddenly have to spend within their means, then nobody's going to be happy about that. Not the sponsors who are not seeing the yield, not the players who want their wages to be as high as they were before, not the organizations who have to lay off staff or cut costs by booking shitty hotels for players, etc., etc. So essentially we have a state where we functioned as if everything was actually working in 2020, 2021, and 2022, because everything did seem to work. But nobody realized that, we're spending unrealistically. All of the companies, even then, were bleeding money because they were just hoping that the yield will eventually increase. They were hoping that their investment is going to pay off. Now people realize the hype around esports is fading because, it's been seemingly been unsuccessful in terms of blowing up as a thing. It's also associated, even in this Bloomberg article, the ad market is shrinking, crypto is in free fall, right? And venture capitalists want to see profits. Like, for some reason, esports and crypto has become like one, like, somehow connected thing. So the crypto market failing is also impacting esports. So, like, we're just sort of in a place where it kind of looks like esports is in the dirt, honestly. Like, it's bad. It's bad. I see there are questions, or I've been messaged that there are questions. How big of a role do fans play to build on that majority? I'll get to that in a second. I have a simpler question from Notas, which is, what is esports washing? It's the same as sports washing, it's just esports washing, right? So essentially, states using their ability to play sports or to play esports to advertise themselves as a good country. So Saudi Arabia is holding the World Cyber Games. There was an event in Saudi Arabia just 2 months ago in Counter-Strike, and funnily enough, like during the ad breaks, they were showing like pictures of Saudi Arabia, and none of the casters said anything bad about Saudi Arabia. In fact, Riyadh was consistently advertised as such a fun place, to the extent that it caused, some controversy. So, but the problem is, much like with sports washing, as long as you succeed in the sport you are washing in, everyone is going to forget about it. So look no further than Manchester City, who have won the Premier League so many times. They are still being questioned about whether there are cheats, etc., etc. But their fans love them. Their fans love their owners. Newcastle United recently got owners from Saudi Arabia. Manchester City is owned by Qatar. Newcastle United is essentially owned by Saudi Arabia now. But their fans love it because they are now playing much better and no longer are in fear of dropping a league down below. So that's how how sports washing works. Esports is the same. If you build, going back to if you build Team Falcons and it has super popular players on it, and if you buy ESL and host some events in Saudi Arabia, and Team Falcons is winning a lot of events, that means that Saudi Arabia is going to get like a good image, most likely. Or like they're at least trying to be seen as a country who does not, murder a bunch of people. Anyway. Yeah. Aglimikshita, to answer your question. How big of a role do the fans play in esports? To build on that, is a majority fan-owned organization possible? I think fans play a massive role in esports. Like, genuinely, here you would have to look at communities like Brazil, etc., etc. You know what? To hell with it. Let's see if I can find something. Is this loud?
In come the Brazilians, and they are going into it. This auto shotgun, this is the ideal spot for it. Will it accomplish anything? No, it's dead right away. Perfecto, back of the bomb site, needs to hold on. The cavalry.
Can you guys hear this, by the way? I hope so. You couldn't hear the sound? God damn it. God damn it. God damn it. Alright, well, I'll give you guys a minute to watch this while I elaborate on the question. I think fans play a massive role in esports because ultimately esports was founded on grassroots, right? So originally people played Counter-Strike for fun, not for prize money. Or originally people played League of Legends for fun and not for money. Fans historically some organizations, those that are profitable, are extremely successful in things like merchandise, in things such as like building clothing brands, etc., etc. In like building basically loyal fan bases, but also like out branching, because as a fact, most esports organizations, when they sign players, they do not get a cut of any, like, or at least like they get a very small percentage, like 10% of the prize pool earnings from the players. So that means that organizations have to make the money up in other ways than the players just winning stuff, right? So that's why fans will always play a big role in esports. Is a fan-owned majority fan-owned organization possible? The reality is, I think no. I think if you set that motion, it's hard to argue if you know how esports works, because then it becomes very lopsided that it's just going to fail. But there are also like fan clubs, almost like, if you know what I'm talking about here, you're gonna get it, sort of. There's like football ultras, what they call them. There's also basketball ultras, right? Like the people who sit in the fan section in Kauno Žalgiris games, right? The biggest of fans. Those ultras exist in esports for certain teams. So Vitality for the Frenchmen. There's the big Vitality are the Stinging Bees, and then you have Vitality is the team. The Stinging Bees are the ultras. In the German organization that is called Big, there's a fan support called the Roaring Bears. And they always travel to these big events, these majors. I've been to a Counter-Strike major before. They get super duper crazy. Like, it's actually kind of nuts. But point being, I don't think a majority fan-owned organization is possible, or at least it's not debatable as a motion. Oh god, I'm not gonna set that motion on the weekend, guys. On Thursday, sorry. It is an interesting thought, though. Like, I'll give it some thought, but like, basically, like, fans, big role, organization, I don't think so. Like, I think that's a bit of a stretch, unless you want to buy like a smaller organization, but those are like bleeding money even more. All right, do esports teams function as businesses themselves, or are they owned by other bigger companies, corporations? Where does their main source of profits come from winning tournaments, match brand deals? All right, so I assume this is like two different questions. Do esports teams function as business themselves, or are they owned by other bigger companies, corporations? Typically, they function as businesses themselves. There are cases where they are owned by other bigger companies or corporations. However, most, like, even like so for example, let's use what example should I use here? Evil Geniuses, for example, is an organization that's an esports team. It was owned by Peak 6 Esports, who are an investing company, right? But in general, there are also rules within tournaments that you cannot submit more than one team. So, for example, if Navi, the team whose jersey I'm wearing, were to participate in a qualifier or even in the tournament, their academy team cannot participate in that same tournament, right? So the answer to the first part of the questions, it depends. But the more typical business model, by far, is that they function as businesses themselves, right? By far, the vast majority of esports organizations are owned as businesses themselves. They do often have shareholders. So if you've watched the video of the Brazilian crowd going wild in I Am Real Major 2022, that organization, the team they are cheering for, Furia, has Neymar as one of their investors / stockholders, shareholders, whatever. So, you know, like Neymar is a name that people should be aware of, roughly. Where does their main source of profit come from? So their main source of profit came from before, from VC money and expecting to get profit somehow. Winning tournaments is typically reserved for players only. Like the organizations either don't get a cut, or they'll get a small cut. Although there are, of course, some garbage organizations who try to steal money away from players. Blah 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 blah. That happens everywhere in football, etc., etc. Merch is a big thing, and brand deals is also a big deal. There's a couple of things in terms of brand deals that are problematic. So, for example, the shirt I'm wearing says GG, well, the jacket says GG.bet. Betting companies have become a big sponsor of esports team in general. And so those have been like very much scrutinized, but that's part of the larger problem of like skins and almost gambling being synonymous with esports, which I could do a whole nother workshop about for an hour. But basically, like, if we go back to the slides, we go back to the, if we go back to, alongside monetization models like skins push esports to new heights of popularity. The like popularity of skins and them being tradable, or them being just like a general thing, has pushed people, like many countries such as the Netherlands, to outright ban some of these things. Or enforce legislation. So, for example, if you open the CSGO case in the Netherlands, while living in the Netherlands, you're going to see what you're going to get, and only then can you purchase the item, right? But basically, there's big worries that like skins, which are expensive, like they can cost up to like 50 euros when we're talking about like Fortnite skins and LoL skins and stuff. CSGO skins literally can go into the millions almost. These things like have been crazy, like in terms of how much they contributed to esports exploding into the big like state it is. And it's also reached problems in when it comes to things like when it comes to specifically things like Fortnite, or other games, because those are often like presumed to be, and like they directly are just marketed at kids, even though it's not just kids playing. And you know, kids being advertised gambling. I don't think I need to elaborate why that's bad. But yes, brand deals are also often like a big thing. Like Red Bull sponsors G2, BMW sponsors G2, Cloud9 is sponsored by MasterCard. There's like basically, if you are a good like organization, you are gonna get a lot of money from merch if you are successful in designing good merch, and you're going to get a lot of money from brand deals. Your players, your staff, your winning tournaments, those like are directly almost bleeding money, except the fact that winning tournaments helps you to get brand deals and helps you to sell your merch, right? But they are not necessarily a source of profit. And again, the vast majority of organizations here are like extremely unprofitable. Extremely unprofitable. There's, I would like to say like probably like 5 to 10 organizations in the world in esports that are profitable at most, which is not a lot. And the rest of them are bleeding money, and that's why everyone's downsizing. Yeah. What else do I have in these slides? Oh, debating motions on esports. All right. This one was set at EUDC 2023. This house would grant substantial authority to esports player unions, including but not limited to influence over tournament format, in-game balance, and working conditions. Shit. EUDC is the European University Debating Championship, for those of you who don't know. This motion was set by Geneva Roy and Claudia Maciejewska, so I'm biased because I consider both good friends. But if you know what you are talking about, then this motion is extremely upsided, because esports player unions have been trying, attempted multiple times, both in games owned by Riot and in games owned by Valve, and overwhelmingly players suck at standing behind unions. So the big deal about this motion was it was set almost 2 days after an announcement was made that the League of Legends Academy League, which is the second league of League of Legends in North America, was going to be abolished after the year. And players decided to organize a strike against it. And then some players, namely this prick called Double Lift, went onto their streams, and even though they agreed to the walkout, after a week they're like, but wait, why aren't we just playing? Which is, well, yeah, players are bad at creating unions. If it would work, great, but the feasibility of this, which of it being positive about tournament format and in-game balance and working conditions, it's not going to be great. And ultimately players are super greedy, etc., etc. It's just a traditional anti-union stance. So yeah, I think that's ultimately how you would analyze the motion. Does anyone want to comment on this motion? Assuming no. All right, we're going to go through a couple more pages. There's going to be a couple more motions, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. What's the vibe here? Do you guys want to do one of those workshop things where you prepare a motion and stuff, or would you want to have a 10-minute activity on one of the motions that I have prepared, or do you want to just go through the motions? We talk about the motions. I see the question, by the way. We talk about the motions, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. Does anyone want to do? Probably not. It's 8:20, but nobody wants to do an exercise. No, okay, I understand. Anyway, to answer the question, often I hear, at least in the Counter-Strike scene, that professional players play 12 to 14 hours a day. Is there a mechanism that tries to make sure that players are not abused to that extent? First of all, I think this is a self-imposed thing, although the pressures of playing professionally are ridiculous. I think this applies to most scenes, League of Legends as well, definitely, Valorant as well. This is also particularly relevant in countries like South Korea and China, which are known to push their players massively in terms of practice. So even the greatest of all time, Michael Jordan of League of Legends, Faker, got burnt out this year and had to get essentially surgery on his wrist. So there's no the Michael Jordan of League of Legends, and simple. Yeah, I don't know. We're not talking about Counter-Strike in depth. Anyway, yeah, simple is an example of a player who quit due to burnout, I guess. But he's also Ukrainian and dealt with great personal drama. To answer your question, no, there's usually not a mechanism that makes sure that players are abused. I think it's often self-inflicted, much like in sports, where people just push themselves too much, even though they don't realize they don't have the skill necessary. And yeah, organizations are evil, but I think like as a player, unfortunately, like if you're a professional player and you're getting paid and you play 12 to 14 hours a day, I am not entirely sure that's a net negative. Like, you could argue in a debate that that's a positive. Because, like, what do you think basketball players do? Like, they just chill out all the time? Like, no, they probably wake up at 7, they go to practice, then they have, like, their own set meal of, like, eggs and whatever, like, with calories counted by their own chef, etc., etc. It's just that, like, no, the amount of practice doesn't change, but the levels of support systems are far lower in esports, particularly when we're talking about bad organizations, right? So no to the mechanism, but I think there is a way you can argue your way out of it, by saying that players are always free to the players are always free to quit. First of all, and secondly, there's multiple players who have succeeded without playing that much. Usually these players that play 14 and 12 hours a day are an outlier. I think that most teams, usually from my like personal Counter-Strike knowledge, most teams spend around 8 to 9 hours a day practicing, but that includes things like team walks, that includes things like team lunch, etc., etc. On days where they're more relaxed, it's more like 6 hours a day. On boot camp, which is when they gather in one place, it's 9 to 10 hours. The 12 to 4 hours a day, like immediately, like in a debate, if you said that, I would say I don't think that's realistic. I think that these are a fringe minority of individuals who push themselves past the limit, and we are talking about the 0.1% of the 0.1% that makes it pro to professional play. And the reality is that organizations have started to like involve sports psychologists, etc., who the dietitians, other support staff, that make it easier for players to not have to abuse themselves, right? If your coach does a lot of the prep work for you, you don't have to do that work yourself. So there's so many ways you can minimize this argument, is my point. But yes, it is a problem to an extent. It's an issue. But the way you argue about against it is that, out of all League of Legends players, 0.01% make it. Out of all professional players, 0.1% abuse themselves to 12 to 14 hours a day. And professional players who earn like extremely high salaries, like we're talking in the upper thousands and in the lower tens of thousands, should be able to like work 8 hours a day, given that like they're pro players, and if they have like dietitians, etc., sports psychologists, which is the like trend in some of the teams, and then that argument is minimized, probably. Does that answer your question, or like do I need a further comment? What is Cristiano's typing? Cristiano, you're gonna continue to type, or or should I go back to the slides? All right, we have a lot of questions. Can we just run over, like, I'm going to assume that there's going to be more questions. Can we just run over really quickly over the motions? I'm going to just, like, tell you the important motions, and then we'll get to the Q&A part. Because, like, clearly, like, I can answer your question. It's going to take a while, Cristian. like, it's going to take, like, 4 minutes. Anyway, yeah. That was the UDC motion. This House believes that states should aggressively invest in gaming technology and esports, right? The geopolitical argument, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. This House would offer esports as a co-curricular activity. I think this is fine. This is also, I think, the case in some countries. I'm not really sure. But academic scholarships for in like US universities are actually like a thing for games like League of Legends and Counter-Strike. So if you want, you can do more research on that. But collegiate esports is a thing. This house opposes the glorification of professional esports players. So this is about like how they are glorified, and this is particularly about Asia and China and how they are extremely glorified there, but also applies to Western players as well. But yeah, this was at World Universities Debating Championships in 2021. I'm pretty sure Urta Radevichute debated in this. This was the year she broke. I love this. I love this motion. I think it's balanced. It's fine. Glorification debates are typically not balanced, but I think this is good. There's not really a correct or wrong answer, whether, like, again, that's the nature of debates, or whether professional players should be glorified or not. But yeah, this is a harms versus benefits debate directly. This is kind of important. This is the motion I want to talk about a bit. This house believes that Nintendo should significantly increase their support for esports. So Nintendo essentially has been massively blocking Super Smash Bros. From becoming successful, or like even more successful than it is as an esport. And they're known as like the developer who just like lawsuits anyone. Like if you try to host a Nintendo tournament, a Nintendo game-based tournament, they're just gonna send you a lawsuit and you're not gonna be able to do it. But the thing is, I have no idea what the op is, because unless the line from op, I guess, is that if Nintendo sponsors esports significantly, then they make their games to be an esport, whereas now and currently they want to actively market games like Mario Kart and Super Smash Bros. To casual audiences, to kids playing with their parents, to drunk 20-year-olds in college who have nothing better to do than play FIFA and Mario Kart, etc., etc. So I think that's probably a valid op line. I think that's probably the right op-line as well. But yeah, game developers supporting like any, you can change Nintendo for any company, but Nintendo is particularly a company that does not, like, actively is against esports as a thing, almost. This house believes that we prefer a larger, more spaced apart patches to regular smaller patches in esports games. So this is about patches. Patches are updates to the game. I'm not sure how many of you have seen the EUDC manual for this year, 2023. But they made it they called it EUDC patch notes. So typically a patch is an update to the game that changes something within the game. Whether the patch is small or big, it depends on the developer, it depends on the game, etc., etc. But essentially, spaced apart patches, I think, assumes that it's going to have more big changes, whereas irregular smaller patches are like having more unpredictability. It's going to be harder for teams to be consistently good. You don't really know who's good, yada yada. That's the line that you probably run in this. Yeah, this house would introduce quotas for women in League of Legends esports teams. Didn't really talk about the women's esports scene at all during this workshop. Unfortunately, like, this is the one thing I can commend Riot Games for. They are actively funding in Valorant what they call game changers teams that are both inclusive to individuals within the LGBTQ plus community and are purely like for women's teams. These things exist, of course, in other games like Counter-Strike, etc., etc. Yeah. So not quite in League of Legends. I think you would replace this with Valorant. But, you know, League of Legends would also work, or any video game would also work. It's a very typical debate. But, yeah, the reality is that whether it be due to stigma, like, it's due to stigma. It's just due to stigma. Gamers are horrible people, and they, like, the amount of stuff I hear coming out of people's mouths as a person who plays Counter-Strike, you know, at like a decent and fairly high level. Yeah, people are not nice to women in video games, and it becomes extremely hard for them to become of equal skill because you're always going to be diminished purely because of the fact that you're a woman. Yeah, so sexism rampant in esports, absolutely rampant. Yeah, homophobia, transphobia, all of that, rampant. The community is weird, like, and it's not a meme about the whole thing where the like gamers are just in a very enclosed space. There's a bunch of nice people. Of course, in esports, but for the vast majority. In professional esports, not so much, right? Like in professional esports, not so much, but in like the grassroots scenes, some certain like subsets, some certain games, it's a big problem. Now, yeah, Q&A part, questions basically. Yeah, that was my workshop, first of all. Now, to answer Christian's questions, and then we'll run over any other questions as well. Feel free to type out your questions, by the way. I'm just going to answer them one by one. If you want to ask me vocally, that's also fine. I just don't know how to do it, but whatever. We'll figure that one out later. Is aging a factor in esports? Are these players free to retire comfortably? Aging is perceived as a factor in esports. I'm not really sure like what the science behind that is. Generally, players do decline as they age, but I'm more sure that's related to Yeva's question about like 12 and 14-hour days where they just experience burnout, as opposed to like a physical decline in their ability. They just start to play less, and then like that's why it becomes a factor. Certain people have been the exception to the norm of aging becoming the factor. Faker being notably one. I think that like generally it shouldn't be a huge factor, but in terms of whether it is perceived to be a factor, yes. And whether teams are willing to take a shot on older individuals, usually the answer is no. So at a certain point, you like companies, organizations, etc., like they do see it as a factor. There's no like research behind like whether it's actually true. Shouldn't really matter. Like I know that like esports is about milliseconds, but like yeah, I don't think like the mental decline from 20 to 25 or from 20 to 30 is significant enough that like age is a factor. And typically esports careers do end around like 30-ish, and then people move on to coaching. But again, I mostly think this is because of burnout, not because of aging being a factor. Or maybe these players are perceived to be washed, right? And my headphones turned off again. Okay, hopefully that didn't screw anything up. Still audible? Thank you. That's very excited. Are these players free to retire comfortably? Could you elaborate what you mean by this? Alright, I'll read the question just for the recording again, and so everyone hears it. In regular sport, even the best players have to do something after retirement because they didn't get enough money, e.g. the bankruptcy of NBA players. Yes, true. Is that the same in esports? Not that I'm like fully aware of. Like typically, like the more successful esports players go into like casting or coaching gigs. The less successful ones go on to regular careers, but they are not like I think very few are paid enough to retire comfortably immediately after their careers. Then you have the tier of like not good enough players to ever earn the wages to be able like to consider retirement. But it's and there's a few examples of like people signing big contracts and then spending all of their money and then being broke almost immediately after, which I can say it, which has happened to a Lithuanian player once. So yeah, like people being irresponsible with the money they earn has certainly happened before in esports. Some players, like if Simple retired today, I'm pretty sure he could live comfortably for the rest of his life. If Faker retired today, Faker is already set for life. His family is set for life. A bunch of like players are set for life. But yeah, of course there are also players who just misspend their money, mismanage their money. This is, I think, part of the much like this trend has decreased in the NBA. I think this is part of the process of esports becoming more professional, right? It's essentially like we're gonna get less examples of people overspending their money, etc., etc. As esports grows into a bigger thing like sports has, where most of these people who now get drafted into the NBA, like the first thing they do, or first thing their team tells them to do, is to hire a financial analyst or an assistant. But right now, yeah, players are dumb. Players don't read their contracts often, right? Like that was an issue back in like 2019, 2020. Still happens to this day, but to a lesser extent. So it's a learning process for everyone. So some of these players could retire comfortably today, but those are the best of the best. Some of these players will overspend their money and not have enough to do. Some of these players will just not earn enough, but will choose to willingly go do other jobs or pursue university degrees, etc., etc. Like, do note that like the retirement age in esports, like while 30 and 30 plus is like, there's a few players still playing. Like typically, I think the retirement age is in League of Legends probably around 24, 23. In Counter-Strike, more like 28, 29. Depends really on the esport. I'm not really sure about the fighting games and all of that. So it depends. But yeah. It's very much mimicking regular sport in that sense. It's just that like esports, I think, is just like a slight bit behind in terms of the development that you need for this. Do you guys have any more questions? I'll take any questions. I'm not gonna lie. If you want, you can request to speak. I think that's a thing, isn't it? No? No one? No. No? Not even, like, no one is even typing? Okay. Well, I guess that's fine. Double check. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for listening to my workshop about esports. The recording will be up on Facebook. I hope I answered all of your questions to a decent extent. So yeah. Best of luck in Thursday's round. I unfortunately will not be present for that, but the motion is going to be set by me. So, you know, I'm just gonna